When I was quite young, around 4 years old, we moved into a subdivision called the Hills of Delafield. And it's still out there. It's now very populated. Back then, there really weren't many people living in it. I think we were either the second or the third family to move into it. And it took a long time for it to develop. And I think it had been there for quite some time because, as I recall, the roads were already a little bit worn and old when we first came in. And if you don't know where Delafield is, so it's a township and also a town in Wisconsin. If you look at where Interstate 94 and Highway 83 come together, well, that's Delafield. And then we lived much closer to the village of Wales, which begins around where 83 and Highway 18 come together. So if you go up 83 about a mile from that intersection, and then you look on the, as you're driving north, the right-hand side, which would be the east, well, there's the entrance to the Hills of Delafield, Glacier Pass, which is a long, windy road that goes all the way around and then comes back to Highway 83. And there's a few cul-de-sacs, these places where the road leaves into another place like, Gray Fox Run was the closer one, and then there's like a little turnaround there. And so anyway, we moved out there, and I've talked about this in some of the other stories. And one of the cool things that happened quite a lot when we were young and before many houses came in there was aeronauts. Balloon people would have their hot air balloons, these gigantic things, right? And they would land them on Glacier Pass. And we saw this happening a number of times. It became less and less frequent as the subdivision began to fill up with houses, but it was still going on. I would say probably from 1975 to maybe 1978 or 1979, which is a long time when you're a kid, right? So those years seem to cover a long, long period. And what would typically happen is, we would play outside much of the time, even in winter, but particularly from spring through summer to autumn. And, you could see this hot air balloon, usually quite colorful with its gondola that people were in, flying, just sort of gliding through the air and coming closer and slowly coming down. And they must have been quite good at guiding these because, the road is not super, super wide. I suppose maybe some of the time they would wind up landing in the prairies or meadows that were, what ended up becoming a lot of the yards. Because the road, which I mentioned, is kind of winding. It wasn't a straight road. There would be, in some cases, scrub or woods near to the road, but in other cases there'd be fields. And nothing out there was very evenly graded. The school district was called Kettle Moraine, and it's called that because of the geographical features that were left behind by the glaciers. Kettles, these sort of depressions, and moraines, another kind, and then there were all sorts of hills and things like that. So we would typically be outside, or somebody in the family would be outside, and they would spot a balloon coming in. And the very first couple times, we were like just in awe, and we'd see this coming down onto the road, and it would be gliding with the wind, but also descending fairly quickly. And if they timed it just right, or if the wind was blowing just right, they would manage to land the balloon, which then, the bucket, the gondola would hit, and it would be kind of, jostling around, and then you'd see the balloon itself collapsing, coming down around, hopefully not on top of the people directly, but off on the side. And there'd usually be, anywhere from 2 to 4 people in these balloons, dressed up kind of warmly because it does get chilly up there. And, we would watch as this happened. And it was like people coming from, somewhere else, not outer space, but they certainly weren't like us. And they were usually fairly young people, like, college student age, I suppose. And this was like a big thing in the area. And it probably happened every 2 or 3 months. Sometimes there'd be, more of them at any particular time. Like maybe they'd be only a couple weeks apart. And then we'd go out and, we'd meet them. And they'd be, literally in the middle of nowhere. Back at that time, the whole area was very undeveloped. There was the village of Wales, and there was like a grocery store there, and a couple churches, and the local elementary school. And then Delafield was way down the road, and there were restaurants in Delafield, but the closest restaurant when we first moved in was a drive-in called Dog and Suds way down off of Highway 83. That was it. That was, for quite a while, that was all that was around there. So they're landing, like I said, in the middle of nowhere, and there was no cell phones at the time. So what they would have to do is, because they were waiting for somebody to come and get them, somebody to come and pick them up. They weren't going to fly their balloon back up or anything like that. They were landing it after whatever journey they were on was finished. And I suppose they must have typically have been coming from the west and the north, because that's the way the winds typically blow. So I don't know, maybe they started out in Madison or one of the other, towns along the interstate, or, further north or something like that. And, so my dad would go out there, and my mom, and it was like a big thing. And my sister, we'd all go out there, and we're, our eyes are big, the kids at least, like saucers. And then my dad would, shake hands with everybody, and my mom would chat with them. And he'd say, hey, do you need to make a phone call? You can come back to our house and use our phone. And so that, they'd leave their balloon there. It's not like anyone was going to be driving on the road. So sometimes they'd pull it off on the side, and sometimes they'd just leave it right in the middle of the road. And then, one of them would come back with my mom or my dad to make the phone call. It's usually a walk of about a quarter to a half a mile to our house. And then we just all wait around until somebody would come out with a truck, or sometimes I think I remember a big van, and they'd, put everything inside there, and then they'd take off. They'd say thanks, and that was that. But one of the things that I do remember about this, and it leads to some regrets on my part, my dad was into home movies, and he had what was called a Super 8 camera, so 8 millimeter. And, it was kind of big and bulky. He would sometimes let me or my sister play around with it and shoot some stuff, but mostly it was him shooting it. And I know that we had footage of a whole bunch of these, walking out there. He'd be filming, and you could see the balloon actually coming down, and the people waving, and, You couldn't hear any sound because the Super 8 didn't have sound. But you'd see people doing this, they're talking. And it was really quite something. And we would watch these, right? So he would take movies of things, and then we'd set up this projection screen, and there was an actual projector, and you'd put the reel of the movie in there, and it would, make that sound as it's going through, and it'd be projected, and we'd be like, yeah, that's the time that this thing happened, and do you remember that? And it was a way of reminiscing together. I remember we would always watch these in the basement, because it was, the one place that we could be assured would be dark enough if we turned the lights off that you could get a really good image. It was pretty rare that we would set up the film stuff upstairs. I think we'd only be able to do it at night, really. And so we would watch these movies, and unfortunately, we didn't keep them. My mom did. She actually had boxes of the movies that my dad had recorded, and when she died, and my sister and I went through all of her stuff, my sister was like, well, do you want these old movies? And I was like, well, I don't have any place to put them. So my sister took them, and like many of the things that she took, unfortunately, they got lost in various moves that she did. She also had a pretty bad boyfriend who got rid of a lot of her stuff that she had inherited, and they just disappeared. All of this footage of all sorts of other things besides the balloons. But the balloons are the thing that I actually remember the best because, you know, we did those things. He recorded it. We watched it together. And then these films just kind of went where they were going to be. And so that's the story. There's not much more to tell about that, but it was something kind of interesting to remember. And I thought I would tell you about it here. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but I was thinking about it the other day and thought it could be something enticing, interesting, whatever you want to think about it. Just think of this image of the balloons, the colorful balloons coming down out of the air in the 1970s, and all of us running out to see what these people were doing.